Welcome back. Now we have a game mode and we'd like to use the game mode to determine when we can start the game. Now some games have a delay or a countdown timer that starts when the game starts, and after a set amount of time, then the player is allowed to move the character, or in our case the tank, around in the world. So we're going to implement that in this video. This is going to involve first disabling the input so we can't move around when the game first starts, and then we're going to set a timer, and after a set amount of time, then we can enable input. So let's go back to Toontank's GameMode.h and add a couple of things here. First, I'd like to add a float for the amount of time that should pass when the game starts before we can start moving. So this float is going to be called start delay. And I'm going to initialize this to 3.f so that we have to wait 3 seconds before we can start the game. Now, as soon as the game starts, I'd like to start this timer, which means I'd like a function that will start this timer, and I'm going to make this a private function as well. I'm going to make this a void function called handleGameStart. Now, I can implement handleGameStart in Toontank's GameMode.cpp down here under Begin Play. Now, I won't forget to add the Toontank's GameMode class name here. And now I have a handleGameStart function. Now, the place to call this would be Begin Play, since Begin Play is called at the start of the game. So I'm going to call handleGameStart here in Begin Play. And since we're doing a couple of things here at the beginning of the game, where setting the tank and the Toontank's player controller variables, I'd like to move these into handleGameStart. So I'm going to move those right down into handleGameStart, and that way tank and Toontank's player controller will be set since we're calling handleGameStart here in Begin Play. So here is where I would like to start a countdown timer, after which we can enable user input. Now, before we start the timer, I'm going to disable input so we can't move the tank just yet. And that's going to require our function we placed here in Toontank's player controller called setPlayerEnabledState. And that means I'm going to use Toontank's player controller. And if I'm going to use Toontank's player controller, it's a good idea to make sure it's valid. So I'm going to say if Toontank's player controller, and if we reach the inside of this if statement, then I can take Toontank's player controller and call setPlayerEnabledState and pass in false, and that way our tank will not be able to move. And I see the red squiggles, and that's because I said Tank's player controller rather than Toontank's. So spelling it correctly, now I get no errors there. So next, we need to start a timer. Now we know that timers involve using an ftimer handle, and we can actually create an ftimer handle rather than having a member variable that belongs to the class. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'm going to call this playerEnableTimerHandle. And next, we need to set a timer. Now, for the callback function for our timer, I'd like to use setPlayerEnabledState, but setPlayerEnabledState is a function that requires an input of type Boolean. Now, we haven't seen how to set a timer using a callback that requires input parameters. This is going to involve a new concept called a timer delegate. So let's take a look at Unreal Engine's timer system again. We know that there's a World Timer Manager, which manages our timers, and it has a setTimer function. Now there are multiple overloads of the setTimer function. We've seen one of them already. Now I'm going to talk about another version of this function, and this version requires a timer handle, a timer rate, or a delay time during which we must wait before our callback function gets called, and instead of taking the address of a callback function directly, it can take something called a timer delegate. This is a struct of type fTimerDelegate, which allows us to create an object that can bind a function directly to it, and timer delegates can bind functions that require input parameters. Now we can create an fTimerDelegate variable and initialize it using the createUObject function from fTimerDelegate. This will create a new timer delegate and initialize it based on what we pass into the parentheses. This will take a user object which is, of course, the class that our callback function exists on. And next, it takes the address of the callback function itself, followed by any input values that we would like passed into our callback once it gets called. From there, we can call setTimer from the World Timer Manager and use the overload that takes a timer delegate. This overload requires the timer handle itself, the timer delegate, the play rate or a float that determines the delay before which our callback will be called, and then a Boolean to determine whether or not our timer should loop. So we know how to create an ftimer delegate. So I'd like you to create one in the handleGameStart function inside of our new if statement. So create a local ftimer delegate and use ftimer delegate create uObject. Now we're going to need to pass in a user object, and usually we've been using this as the user object, but the function we'd like called exists on the player controller. So pass in our variable ToonTank's player controller as the first input. That's going to be the user object. And the callback function is going to be setPlayerEnabledState, that function we added to our custom player controller. Don't forget the address of operator. And as the third input, we're going to pass in the value true. This is what will be passed into setPlayerEnabledState when our callback gets called at the end of the timer. So pause the video and give this a try now. So just under our timer handle, I'm going to create a local ftimer delegate. And I'm going to call this PlayerEnableTimerDelegate. That's okay if you named it something else. Now I'm going to initialize this using ftimerDelegate create uObject. And this will first take a user object, and that's going to be our ToonTank's player controller. So I'm going to say ToonTank's player controller as the first input, and for the second, we need our callback function. And that's going to be a ToonTank's player controller setPlayerEnabledState, and I can't forget I need the address of operator for this function address. And the value that I'd like passed into this callback function is going to be true. That way, at the end of the delay time, when this callback gets called, true will be the value passed in to the callback function. Now I'm ready to call setTimer, which means I need to call getWorldTimerManager, and then from there I can call setTimer, and the function overload we're using first takes a timer handle, and that's going to be PlayerEnableTimerHandle. The next input I'm going to pass in will be the delegate, so that's going to be PlayerEnableTimerDelegate. Next we need our delay time, and that's going to be start delay, which is the float we just created. So next I'm passing in start delay. And finally, I don't want this timer to loop, so I'm going to pass in false so that we don't get looping behavior. Now I'm going to go ahead and indent these inputs so it looks pretty. And now we're calling setTimer using our new timer delegate. And at the end of this delay time, we should get our callback function setPlayerEnabledState called with the value true passed in. Now since start delay is 3 seconds and we're calling setPlayerEnabledState passing in false before we set our timer, when we press play we shouldn't be able to move until this 3-second delay is up. So let's compile this and see how it works. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and I'm trying to move around and I can't, and after 3 seconds I can suddenly move. And also check this out. Notice that my cursor is the crosshairs. It may be hard to see on the screen, but you should be able to see it on your screen just fine. And this makes it a lot easier for me to aim and control my tank's turret rotation. Perfect. So in summary, we created a handleGameStart function for the game mode, and we're calling this in begin play. And we also set a timer using a timer delegate onto which we bound our setPlayerEnabledState function on the player controller. This allowed us to have a function callback for our timer that takes input parameters. And we use this to enable user input after a 3-second delay when the game starts. Now this could be frustrating for a player if they didn't have some sort of visual cue sort of letting them know that input is not enabled, something like a countdown on the screen. So we'll take care of that in future videos, but for now, congratulations! You now know how to bind a function that takes input parameters to a timer delegate. I'll see you in the next video.